Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today we're taking a focused look at a really important and sensitive topic, the genetics of suicide.
That's right. We're using a recent narrative review published in the journal Genes. It's called Genetics of Suicide by Khalil, Kaliankou, and Bellin. It gives us a good map.
And our mission here, as always, is to take this scientific research and really unpack the key insights for you.
Yeah, we want to help you get a handle on what's most important about this complex interplay between our genes and our environment when it comes to suicide risk.
And it is a huge challenge. The review points this out right away. Suicide is a major public health issue in the U.S.
The numbers are sobering.
They really are. In 2022, it was the 11th leading cause of death overall. But tragically, it becomes the second leading cause for younger people, ages 10 to 14 and also 20 to 34.
And predicting who is at risk is still incredibly difficult.
Exactly. The authors note that part of the reason is we still lack a really clear understanding of the underlying biology involved.
Right. We know environmental factors, social situations, they're huge drivers. But the biological piece, especially the genetics, well, that's what scientists are really trying to map out right now.
And this is where the review gets really interesting, I think. It lays out evidence suggesting there is a genetic component to suicide risk. And importantly, it suggests this genetic risk might be, well, somewhat independent of the genetic risk we know exists for psychiatric disorders.
That's a really key point we'll dig into.
We'll also look at specific biological systems that seem to be linked to things like serotonin and a brain protein called BDNF.
And the role of epigenetics, too, which is fascinating. It's about how our experiences can actually change how our genes work.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing stuff. And we'll
Oh.
even touch on how newer tools like machine learning are being used to try and, identify people who might be at higher risk.
Okay, so maybe let's start by just setting the stage, looking at the scope of the issue, using some of the statistics the review mentions.
Good idea. The numbers themselves tell a story. The overall age-adjusted rates, they've fluctuated. They went up between 2002 and 2018, dipped a bit, then rose again to 14.2 per 100,000 in 2022.
But those overall numbers hide some really stark differences.
They do. The review highlights the significant disparity between males and females. Male rates are consistently much higher in 2022. It was 23.0 per 100,000 compared to 5.9 for females.
Wow, and there's significant ethnic and age differences mentioned too, right?
Yes. The review points out that non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaskan Native individuals have the highest rates, particularly males, at 39.2 per 100,000 in 2022, followed by non-Hispanic white individuals.
And older adults too.
Right, especially those 85 and older, they face disproportionately high rates.
And the review even mentions variation by state. Geography plays a role.
It does. They cite data from 2021 showing Wyoming with a high rate around 32.3 per 100K compared to New Jersey, which was much lower at 7.1.
And the authors suggest reasons for that variation. Things like differences in population makeup, rural versus urban settings, maybe access to mental health care.
Access to care, yeah. And they also mention the availability of firearms as a potential factor contributing to those state differences.
Okay, so beyond the stats, what other risk factors does the review lay out, just to complete the picture?
Well, it lists many documented ones, things like relationship or family conflict, unemployment, low socioeconomic status, social isolation,
Hopelessness, impulsivity.
right? Incarceration, a history of childhood abuse. All these are known risk factors.
So even before we get into the genetics specifically, the paper makes it clear. Suicide risk comes from this really complex web of environmental, social, and psychological factors.
Exactly. And the central idea here is how genetics adds another layer, a dynamic one, to this already complex picture.
Okay, so let's talk about that genetic layer. How does the review build the case that genes contribute their own specific risk? What's the foundational evidence look like?
Well, they start with the classic methods, right? Twin studies and family studies.
Exactly. Twin studies are kind of like a natural experiment. You compare identical twins who share practically all their DNA with fraternal twins who share about half, like regular siblings.
And if identical twins are more likely to share a trait like suicidal behavior than fraternal twins.
Then it suggests there's a biological or genetic component involved. And the review mentions a meta-analysis, basically pooling data from multiple studies.
Okay.
And it showed much higher concordance rates. This is the likelihood both twins show the trait for suicide in identical twins, around 19.5%.
Compared to fraternal twins.
Much lower, only about 2.3%. That big gap is pretty strong evidence pointing towards some kind of biological predisposition.
And family studies show similar things, that suicide risk seems to cluster in families.
Yeah, offspring of parents who died by suicide also have increased rates. It points towards a predisposition running in families.
Okay, but here's that key idea you mentioned earlier. The review suggests this genetic risk might be, what was it? Partially independent.
Partially independent, exactly. Independent of the genetic risk for psychiatric disorders themselves.
Which is a really important distinction because we know something like 90% of people who die by suicide have a psychiatric condition, like depression or bipolar disorder.
Right, and those conditions definitely have their own genetic links. So you might just assume the family risk for suicide is really just the family risk for, say, depression.
But this review suggests it's more complicated than that.
It does. It points to studies trying to tease this apart. For example, studies that compared relatives of people who died by suicide and had a disorder versus relatives of people with the same disorder who did not die by suicide.
Ah, okay. Trying to isolate the suicide risk factor.
Precisely. Or another example is a study in the Amish population. They found families with high rates of mood disorders, but interestingly, without a history of suicide in those same families.
Huh. So it implies there might be genetic pathways that specifically increase vulnerability to suicidal thoughts or behaviors, not just to the underlying mental illness in general.
That's the implication. And the review also highlights a large genome-wide association study, a GWS.
That's where they scan the whole genome.
Right. And this big GWS found a specific location, a locus, on one chromosome that was associated with suicide even after they statistically controlled for major psychiatric disorders.
Wow. Okay, so that partial independence idea isn't just theoretical. There's some genomic data pointing that way.
Exactly. And the review also mentions heritability estimates from twin studies. They suggest that genetics accounts for maybe 45–48% of the variation in suicidal behavior across the population.
So a significant chunk, but definitely not the whole story. Environment still plays a huge role.
Absolutely. Non-shared environmental factors like unique life experiences seem to account for maybe 44–64%. And one study in military men even found potentially distinct genetic influences for suicidal thoughts versus suicide attempts.
Okay, that's compelling evidence that genetics is adding something specific here. So let's get into some of the biological systems the review talks about. Where did they start?
A major focus, historically and currently, has been the serotonin system. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger in the brain, really important for mood, sleep, impulses.
And it's the target for many common antidepressants, right? Like
Yeah.
SSRIs.
Exactly. So researchers have looked closely at genes involved in making serotonin, like the TPH genes, TPH1 and TPH2.
And what did they find? A clear link.
Well, it's mixed, honestly. Some studies found associations between variations in these genes and suicidal behavior, but others haven't. The picture is often inconsistent.
Why the inconsistency?
It could be a lot of things the review touches on. Differences in study methods, which specific populations were studied. Maybe the genetic variant is linked more broadly to just general psychiatric risk rather than suicide specifically.
Okay. What about the genes for the serotonin receptors? The docking stations for serotonin on brain cells?
Similar story there, unfortunately. Genes like 5-HT1A, 5-HT2A, they've been studied a lot. But again, the review points out really variable findings.
Depends on the study, the population.
Right. Maybe interactions with environmental factors play a role in whether a specific genetic variant actually increases risk in a given person. It highlights a real challenge in this field. Replicating findings is tough.
Okay. But what about the serotonin transporter gene? 5-HTTLPR. That one seems to come up a lot in depression research, too.
It does. That gene influences how quickly serotonin gets cleared away from the synapse, the gap between neurons. There's a well-known variation often called the short and long allele.
And the short allele is less efficient, right?
Right.
Leads to less serotonin activity.
Generally, yeah, that's the idea. Now, individual studies on its link to suicide have also been mixed. But the review notes that meta-analyses, combining many studies,
Okay.
they do generally find an association between having the short allele and increased risk of suicidal behavior. Particularly, it seems, within groups of patients who share the same psychiatric diagnosis.
So maybe it increases vulnerability, especially if someone already has, say, depression.
That could be one interpretation. It suggests the serotonin system is likely involved, but it's clearly part of a much bigger, more complex picture, not a single suicide gene.
Right, definitely not. So what other systems does the review highlight as being important?
Another really key player they discuss is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
BBNF, that sounds important. What does it do?
Think of it like fertilizer for your brain cells. It's crucial for the growth, survival, and connections of neurons. Really vital for brain health and plasticity.
And is there a specific gene variation linked to suicide risk here?
There's one very common variation in the BDNF gene that's been studied extensively called Val66Met. It affects how BDNF is processed and released.
And the link to suicide.
Again, it's a bit messy. The review notes it's been studied across various psychiatric conditions and ethnic groups, thinking it might mediate suicide risk. Some studies found associations, maybe a trend for the MET version of the gene, or linked specifically with suicide attempts.
But not consistently.
Right. Other studies, including one looking at post-mortem brains of suicide completers, didn't find a clear link with this specific Val66Met variant. Replication is a challenge here, too.
Okay, so the specific gene variant is hard to pin down consistently, but you mentioned something earlier about epigenetics and BDNF being more consistent.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting, and the review emphasizes this. Epigenetics, remember, is about changes that affect how genes are used or expressed, without changing the underlying DNA code itself.
Like adding little chemical tags to the DNA.
Exactly, like methylation. And the review highlights that one type of epigenetic mark, called hypermethylation, specifically on the promoter region of the BDNF gene.
The promoter is like the on switch.
Sort of, yeah. Hypermethylation there often acts like a dimmer switch, turning down the gene's activity. So less BDNF protein gets made.
Okay, and this hypermethylation.
It's been found pretty consistently in post-mortem brain studies of people who died by suicide, specifically in certain brain regions.
And also in living patients.
Yes, the review mentions studies finding it in individuals with depression and suicidal thoughts as well.
Wow. And what drives that epigenetic change?
Well, this is crucial. The review points to evidence strongly linking this BDNF hypermethylation to a history of childhood abuse or adversity in those who died by suicide.
So trauma might actually leave a physical mark on the BDNF gene, reducing its activity, which then could increase vulnerability.
That's exactly the implication. It raises a critical question. Is the hypermethylation a direct biological marker of suicide risk itself? Or is it more a consequence of early life trauma, which then increases the risk for suicide, perhaps partly through altering BDNF function?
That really connects the dots between environment and biology in a tangible way. Trauma isn't just psychological, it can get under the skin epigenetically.
It seems so. And that leads directly into another biological system the review discusses, one that's strongly influenced by stress and trauma, the HPA axis.
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that's the body's main stress response system, right?
Exactly. It controls the release of stress hormones, like cortisol. And disturbances in this system, like being chronically overactive or not shutting off properly, are linked to increased suicide risk.
Often associated with early life adversity or trauma.
Yes, very often.
Yeah.
The review mentions things like the dexamethasone suppression test, or DST. When the HPA axis isn't working right, cortisol levels don't get suppressed like they should after taking dexamethasone, and this non-suppression is linked to completed suicide.
And is HPA axis function heritable? Can you inherit a tendency for a more reactive stress system?
Apparently so. The review notes that HPA reactivity has a genetic component. So variations in the genes that regulate this system could influence how strongly someone reacts to stress and potentially increase their suicide risk.
Which genes are we talking about here?
The review mentions several, like NR3C1, which codes for the receptor that cortisol binds to, and FKBP5, which helps regulate that receptor. Also CRHBP, involved in stress hormone regulation. Variations in these genes can affect HPA function.
And do they interact with trauma?
Yes, some studies show that variations in these genes might increase suicide risk, particularly in people who've experienced childhood trauma. It's another gene-environment interaction.
Are there other related genes mentioned?
They also touch on GABA-related genes. GABA is the main calming neurotransmitter in the brain, and it helps inhibit the HPA axis, so variations there might affect stress reactivity too. And another gene, SKA2, involved in glucocorticoid receptor function, has shown links through both genetic variations and methylation.
And epigenetics plays a role in the HPA axis genes too, similar to BDNF.
Absolutely. The review highlights this, especially for the NR3C1 gene, the glucocorticoid receptor gene. Hypermethylation, particularly of one specific variant called GR1F, has been found in suicide completers who experienced childhood abuse.
And that methylation reduces the gene's expression.
Right, which could impair the HPA axis negative feedback loop, meaning the stress response doesn't shut off as effectively. It mirrors the BDNF findings trauma, potentially leaving epigenetic marks on key stress-related genes.
The review also briefly mentions a couple of other areas, right? Cell signaling and inflammation.
Yeah, they touch on alterations found in molecules involved in cell communication pathways, things like GSK3, PKC, PKA, particularly in postmortem brains of teenage suicide victims.
But it's hard to know if those are causes or consequences.
Exactly. The review notes the challenge is determining if these are true biological markers of vulnerability, what we call endophenotypes, or if they're just changes reflecting the suicidal state or the underlying mental illness itself. We need more data on their heritability.
Okay. And inflammation. That seems linked to everything these days.
It does seem to be a common factor in many conditions. The review discusses the overlap between inflammation, sickness behavior, and depression. They're all associated with elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are signaling molecules of the immune system.
And how does that link to suicide?
Well, meta-analyses have shown correlations between higher levels of certain cytokines, like interleukin-1 beta, IL-1, and especially interleukin-6, IL-6, and suicidality. These differences are found in blood, cerebrospinal fluid, and even brain tissue. IL-6 seems to have the most consistent association.
So inflammation might be part of the biological pathway. Are there genetic links here too?
Yes. The review mentions some genetic studies finding specific variations in genes related to inflammation, like TNF-alpha and IL-6, that might increase susceptibility. And again, epigenetics pops up things like microRNAs, which are small molecules that regulate gene expression, can influence cytokine levels.
It's layers upon layers. So we've talked about specific systems. What about broader approaches, looking at the whole genome without a specific hypothesis?
Right, that's where genome-wide association studies, or GUIs, come in. It's an unbiased approach. You scan potentially millions of genetic variations across the entire genome in lots of people.
And see if any specific variations are more common in people with the trait you're studying, like suicide attempts?
Exactly. It's powerful for discovery, but it has challenges.
Like?
Well, you need huge sample sizes to get statistically meaningful results because the effects of individual variants are often very small. There's also the risk of false positives. And critically, GWAS shows association, not necessarily causation. Just because a variant is linked doesn't mean it directly causes the outcome.
Okay. So what have these large GWAS studies actually found regarding suicide?
The review highlights a few things. There's definitely some overlap found between the genetic risk factors for suicide and those for major psychiatric disorders like depression or schizophrenia. That's maybe expected.
But anything more specific to suicide itself?
Yes. And this is maybe one of the most crucial findings the review discusses. It comes from a huge meta-analysis combining data from many studies involving nearly 30,000 people who had attempted suicide.
Wow, that's a massive sample. What did they find?
They identified two specific locations, or loci, in the genome that were significantly associated with suicide attempts. One was in a region involved in the immune system, the MHC region. The other was an intergenic spot on chromosome 7.
Okay. And what's so significant about that chromosome 7 finding?
Here's the key part the review emphasizes. This association on chromosome 7 remained statistically significant even after the researchers controlled for the presence of psychiatric disorders.
Ah. So that directly supports that partial independence idea we talked about earlier, a potential genetic signal for suicide risk itself, separate from general mental illness risk?
Precisely. And the finding was also replicated in an independent sample, which makes it much more robust and less likely to be a fluke.
That feels like a really solid lead. Does the review say anything about what that region on chromosome 7 might be related to?
Interestingly, yes. It notes that this same genetic region has previously been linked in other studies to things like general risk-taking behavior, smoking initiation, and insomnia.
So a potential genetic link to suicide located in an area of the genome that also influences behavioral traits related to impulsivity, addiction, sleep. That's fascinating.
It really is. It starts to paint a picture of specific biological pathways that might contribute to vulnerability. It's a concrete step.
Definitely. Now, the review also mentioned newer tools being used, like machine learning. How does that fit in?
Right. Machine learning, or ML, is seen as a promising approach. It can handle really complex, large data sets and look for patterns that might be missed by traditional statistics.
How is it being applied to suicide research?
One major way is by analyzing electronic health records, or EHRs. These records contain a vast amount of information diagnoses, medications, demographics, lab results, visit history.
So ML algorithms can sift through all that data.
Exactly. They can try to identify complex combinations of factors that might predict future risk. The review gives an example of a study by Walsh and colleagues back in 2017.
And what did that model do?
It used EHR data to predict future suicide attempts, and apparently it did so with pretty good accuracy, which sounds incredibly useful for potentially identifying high-risk individuals in healthcare settings earlier.
That does sound promising. Are there limitations?
Oh, definitely. The review wisely cautions about this. A major one is generalizability. A model trained on data from one hospital system or population might not work as well in a different setting. The data itself can have biases. So while promising, it's still an evolving area.
Okay. So taking a step back now, pulling all these different threads together, the twin studies, the specific genes, epigenetics, GWAS, ML, how does the review synthesize this complex picture?
It really comes back to that core message we started with. Suicide risk is incredibly complex and dynamic. It's not down to just one thing.
Not just genes, not just environment.
Right. It's driven by this constant, intricate interaction between genetic factors, epigenetic modifications, those changes in how genes get read based on experience and environmental factors from early life onwards.
So the review strongly emphasizes that genetics is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It's not deterministic.
Absolutely not. Finding genetic links doesn't mean suicide is inevitable for someone with certain genes. The review stresses that these genetic factors interact with a whole host of other things, like personality traits, impulsivity, cognitive function, coping skills, those early life experiences we talked about, and also broader societal factors, social support, cultural context, economic conditions. All of it plays a role.
It truly is a multi-layered phenomenon. You can't really understand it by looking at just one layer.
No, you really can't. Understanding how those layers interact is the real challenge and where the field needs to go.
So to wrap up this deep dive then, we've journeyed through a lot of complex research outlined in this review. We've explored the biological threads from the foundational twin studies suggesting heritability to specific systems like serotonin and BDNF, the really impactful role of epigenetics linking trauma to gene function, and these broader genomic and machine learning approaches.
And as the source itself concludes, while there's been real progress, there are still quite a few inconsistencies in the findings across different studies. That sort of undermines reliability right now, and it highlights that well, the field is still very much developing. Significant work is definitely still needed.
The authors really suggest some specific future directions, don't they?
They do. Things like integrating polygenic risk scores, which try to capture the small effects of many genes added together into research. Continuing to leverage machine learning, but carefully.
And needing larger studies.
Yes, conducting really large-scale studies that include diverse populations, multi-ethnic groups, is crucial. And they also mention using newer lab techniques like studying brain organoids derived from patient stem cells to potentially model some of these biological pathways directly.
It sounds like a field really pushing the boundaries, trying to get at vulnerability on a very fundamental level.
It is. It's trying to understand those biological underpinnings.
So the review leaves us with this picture. Genetics clearly plays a role, but it's woven into this vast interconnected network of influences, biological, environmental, social, personal history. And that finding, the replicated one, of a specific genetic spot linked to suicide independently of diagnosed psychiatric illness, that's particularly striking, isn't it?
It really is. It opens up new avenues for thinking about risk.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. What does this incredibly complex, still evolving picture teach us about how we might better understand and maybe one day better prevent suicide? How do we effectively integrate all these different layers of knowledge, the genetic, the epigenetic, the environmental, the psychological, the societal?
Yeah. How do we put all those pieces together? Something to think about.